Okay, good evening, everybody. Good to see you all, and welcome to this year's Hyman Memorial Lecture, which will be given by Richard Bennett, the UN Special Rapporteur on Afghanistan, whose talk today is entitled "Controlling Women, Controlling Society: The Politics of Virtue in Afghanistan." And I'll introduce Richard in a second and tell you a little bit about his own background. We're delighted to have him, and he's very well qualified to be talking on these issues. My name is Jonathan Goodhan. I'm a professor in conflict and development studies at SOAS. And I'm also a member of the Centre for the Study of Contemporary Central Asia and the Caucasus, who are hosting this event today. So I just want to give say a few words about this event, because I can see actually quite a lot of younger people here today, probably who may not have been to the Anthony Hyman Memorial Lecture before. This is an event that's been going on since 2002. The first one was given by Barney Rubin. There are a few of you who are here at that event, and there's been one almost every year since. So this is become a really important event in the UK, which it celebrates the life and the memory and the scholarship of Anthony Hyman, who was a long-time scholar of Central Asia and Afghanistan, and was a great friend of SOAS. And in a way, as we've all grown older, going through the Anthony Hyman Memorial Lecture, the series has charted the very turbulent and often unpredictable history of Afghanistan and its place in the world and the wider region. And it's a celebration of Anthony's life and his work, and we hope it keeps alive some of the things that he valued, including serious scholarship and engagement with the country. I would also like to share a memory of somebody else very dear to all of us who have been at this seminar series for many years, and that's David Page, who very sadly passed away last year. And he was the key person behind getting this seminar series off the ground and driving it forwards over the last 20 plus years. And many of you will have known David here as a friend, someone you worked with, and he inspired great affection and respect amongst all of us who knew him. He was a scholar of South Asia. He did a PhD on the region. He played a central role in setting up the BBC World Service South Asia Division. He was a researcher. He was a human rights advocate on media freedom in the region. And for many years, he was the chair and trustee of Afghan Aid and a regular visitor to the country. Many, many Afghans and those living outside the country have very fond memories of David, and he is sorely missed. And just for your information, we will be holding an event at SOAS next term in memory of his life and his work. So we'll be in touch with you about that. Now, let me introduce Richard and the subject of the talk. So gender has unsurprisingly been a recurring theme in several of our Anthony Hyman Memorial talks. It's always been contentious, it's always been politicized, and it's always exposed divisions within Afghanistan and between Afghans and between Afghans and the international community. And the divisions have probably never been as stark as they are now, in which women live in a situation that the UN has labeled gender apartheid. And the fact that we now have a very good audience today shows how there's a lot of public interest in this issue. And I don't think we've got anyone today who could be, could be more qualified than Richard to talk about these issues. And without giving away the subject, the content of his talk, Richard is going to be placing questions of gender within historical context and a wider human rights framework, hopefully to provide us with some insights about how to frame, to understand and respond to the current context in Afghanistan. So let me very briefly introduce Richard. He was born in Grimsby, so like me, he's a Lincolnshire yellowbelly. But you might not know the term, but he comes from Lincolnshire, but he moved to Auckland, New Zealand when he was 6 with his family, went to university there, did an MA in social anthropology, And something I didn't know about him was when he came back to England, he was a serious cricketer and played a season for the Hampshire second 11. So he embarked on a career in human rights with the UN. He started in Sierra Leone and then East Timor. And that led to his first engagement with Afghanistan as head of human rights in UNAMA. After further stints with the UN in Nepal and New York to work on Sri Lanka and South Sudan, he then left the UN and joined Amnesty International, first in London as a program director for Asia, which took him back to Afghanistan several times, and then to New York, which again brought him back to Afghanistan. There's a recurring theme here. Many of you will recognize this phenomena. Always getting attracted back to Afghanistan, always kind of becoming a life's work in many ways. So he was brought back to Afghanistan and he rejoined UNAMA, and he was there with UNAMA until 2019. Subsequently, he continued to support the Afghan Independent Human Rights Commission until the collapse of the Republic in 2001. Then in 2022, Richard was appointed as the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Afghanistan. As such, he's mandated to monitor the situation of human rights in Afghanistan, and this includes reporting on the situation of human rights, assisting the fulfillment of human rights obligations arising from international treaties that Afghanistan has ratified, offering support and advice to civil society, documenting and preserving information related to human rights violations and abuses, integrating a gender perspective, a child rights perspective, and a survivor-centered approach throughout the work of the mandate, and reporting to the Human Rights Council and to the General Assembly. Now, Richard in 2024 was barred from entering the country by the Taliban, and therefore these duties have had to be performed from a distance. So welcome to Richard. Just a reminder of the format, there will be about 40-minute talk from Richard. We'll then open it up for question and answers. And then we, at around 7:30, 7:45, we'll go for a reception, which is over in the Paul Webley building. There'll be Charles will be directing you there. And I'd like to thank Central Asian Survey, Shahid, Mira, Zara, and Madeline, who contributed, who have supported the reception, have continued to support the Anthony Hyman Memorial Lecture for many years. So thank you to them. But now, if you can join me in welcoming Richard.
I think you've left your phone. Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Jonathan, for your kind, generous introduction. And I'm glad there's a reception afterwards, because I can see some friends in the audience, and I'm looking forward to having the opportunity to have a chat after a while with some of you. I'm very honored to be invited to deliver the Anthony Hyman Memorial Lecture, and I thank you, Jonathan, and Charles, and SOAS, as well as Anthony's family. I didn't know Anthony, but I know of his reputation, and that his legacy continues to inform and inspire contemporary work. I can see my friend Elizabeth Winter in the audience, and she told me that he was certainly an erudite and dedicated academic, but also enjoyed getting together with people of similar interests, including relaxing networking evenings at his home. And this apparently led to the setting up of the Afghan Refugee Information Network, and in turn BARG a bit later, which kept going for 40 years. I can see that this is an audience. You are an audience that's well informed about Afghanistan. That makes me nervous, actually. I'm going to try and intersperse describing key elements of the human rights situation as I assess it, with which many of you will be familiar, with some thoughts and reflections related to, well, the title's gone, related to the title of this lecture, Controlling Women, Controlling Society, the Politics of Virtue in Afghanistan. And I'll try to provoke or inspire some discussion. I struggled a bit with where to start. But in my head is a remark by a very senior humanitarian who I met recently, who just returned from Afghanistan and had managed to travel around the country. And he said, certainly the Taliban are a problem, but they're not the biggest problem. It's the economy that's the biggest problem. It's the desperation of people living without means, in poverty. But with that, and I wanted to start with that, let me revert to the human rights situation, which is also appalling. The Taliban's return to power since 2021 has been marked by egregious human rights violations, which are documented in many reports, including mine. Step by step, the Taliban have tightened their grip, increased repression, and created a climate of fear. The situation for women and girls is dire. However, even if it were possible to leave that aside, which of course it's not, there would still be grave concerns about lack of human rights of respect for human rights in the country. For example, soon after seizing power, the Taliban dismantled most of the institutions needed to ensure respect for human rights in any society. They abandoned the Constitution, the Electoral Commission, the Human Rights Commission. They converted the Ministry of Women's Affairs into the Ministry for the Promotion of Virtue and Prevention of Vice. They replaced legally trained judges with mullahs and scrapped the prosecutors. And as well as torture and ill treatment, including in detention centers, especially for those who previously worked for the Republic government or the security forces, as well as activists, in particular women protesters. I also continue to receive, credible reports of sexual violence in detention. In fact, the emails, the videos, the pictures that I receive, and I know many of you receive every day, leave me sickened. They're shared by victims, desperate survivors of torture, both men and women. Almost all the guardrails against excesses of power have been abandoned. And while a so-called general amnesty was announced for members of the Republic security forces and others, reprisals have been common and continue, including extrajudicial killings, torture, and arbitrary detention. I'm struck that at a time when others were claiming that the Taliban had reformed in August 2021, I retain vivid memories of desperate Afghans clinging onto aircraft taking off from Kabul airport. They did not have any confidence that the Taliban had reformed, and they have been proven correct, sadly. Yet not only does much of this go unnoticed, it appears, ironically, that the gradual normalization of the Taliban is going hand in hand with their incrementally greater restrictions and repression. Before I go further, I'm talking a lot, and I will talk a lot about the Taliban because this is the subject, it's the contemporary scene. However, there have been serious human rights violations through much of Afghanistan's history, including during the Republic. we shouldn't forget that. Victims are victims and deserve justice regardless of the perpetrator. I'd like to note that just as the de facto authorities began their regime relatively light-handedly, so they treated visitors like me cordially during an initial honeymoon period. I was able to visit 3 times after taking up my mandate and met high-level officials and was able to travel to where I wanted. I've been to Kandahar, I've been to Panjshir, been to Mazar a few times, Bamiyan. I wasn't restricted. However, after my reports and statements began to flow, the mood soured. And eventually, last summer, they announced that I was no longer welcome. It wasn't a great surprise. And when I was meeting with the Taliban at ministerial and governor level, provincial governor level, they acknowledged Afghanistan's international human rights treaty obligations, but always with the caveat of their compliance with these being subject to Sharia. They left the gate open. But they also called for recognition of their achievements. And they described these as better security, no corruption, and having rid the country of narcotics. And they also insisted that from our side, there should be no double standards. Where were you when we were detained in Guantanamo? I've been asked several times. More recently, the double standards in Gaza and other places would, I'm sure, be raised. They felt picked on. They felt singled out. They presented themselves almost as victims in these early discussions. I'll be happy in the Q&A to outline the impact on my mandate of not being able to visit Afghanistan at the moment. However, I do want to just share a word on methodology. With support from my team, we implement UN standards of both methodology and ethics, including a scrupulous commitment to accuracy, objectivity, and impartiality. Do we make errors? Undoubtedly, we're human. Are we confident generally in the veracity of the information we publish? Absolutely, we are. Last week, I participated in a virtual event where last year's lecturer, Kate Clark, whom I know well, was also a speaker. Kate began her remarks, and she's always well worth listening to, by saying that the Taliban in contemporary Afghanistan are powerful, and they believe that they're divinely inspired to create an Islamic emirate in which obedience to the emir is a religious duty. There's no space for dissent and not much even for discussion. The emir would rather let Afghans starve than allow girls to go to school beyond 6th grade. And today, it's 1,286 days since girls were barred from going to school and counting. Moreover, the Taliban appear to respond to neither carrots nor sticks. Neither threatening nor coercing them works. However, and this is what Kate said, many of their actions are distinctly un-Afghan, including allowing intrusion into private space and family matters. So what are the choices in this situation? Are there any half-decent ones? I hope we can come back to those questions. There's a couple of scenarios that I'll kick off with. The Taliban control, number one, is the Taliban control the country. There are no good options. The least worst option is to try, it's a terrible phrase, but people, got picked up a lot these days with least worst option, try to mitigate damage, preserve space, and maybe create more through external programs. As the economy can't survive without support, there's a need for some cooperation internally and externally. This scenario argues in favor of engagement with some steps towards with a need for some cooperation internally and externally. It's for step engagement with some steps towards normalization. You might recognize some countries, some institutions that accept that kind of scenario. Another scenario is that the Taliban is not as stable as they project themselves to be, nor do they have majority support among Afghans, even inside Afghanistan. That governments in Afghanistan change quickly and unexpectedly. Normalization of the Taliban is premature, to say the least. Pressure may not appear to be working, but building up pressure will have an impact. And pressure for accountability does count. Now, I just want, having set out those scenarios, I want to describe the situation a little bit more, drawing particularly from my most recent two reports. I'll begin by discussing or describing the systematic oppression of women and girls, including via the law on the promotion of virtue and prevention of vice. I'll just call it vice and virtue, about which I've written a report at the Human Rights Council's request, and I tabled it just over about a month ago, actually exactly a month ago tomorrow. And I'll move on to after that to other concerns, which are mainly covered in the other report that I wrote. So on women and girls, the Taliban are strongly committed to pursuing their deeply discriminatory and misogynistic agenda. But why? They claim that they're protecting women's virtue under Islam and Afghan traditions. Many Afghan women don't agree with that, and many men too. They tell me that an educated and empowered woman is a threat to the domination of the Taliban patriarchy. Interestingly, the Taliban also seek to repress women to protect their own male piety. A recent example is the order that windows, such as in a kitchen, must be covered to avoid women being seen through them. A Taliban spokesperson actually acknowledged that this is to prevent men from having improper thoughts, which could impact them on the day of judgment, I understand. Does that not suggest that it's not women who are weak, it's men who are weak? Yeah. At another level, by controlling women, the Taliban consider they will secure a stronger and longer-term grip on Afghan society. Women run the home and raise children. Controlling this will help shape the future. Conservative women will raise conservative kids. However, left free to be educated, to work, to speak, to have agency, to be independent, women are a threat to a male-dominated emirate. And indeed, the Taliban are taking active steps to both to consolidate and codify their notions of virtue and vice, to perpetuate their ideology and solidify social control. Nowhere can this be seen more clearly than in the Vice and Virtue Law, which was published in August last year. In many ways, this law or so-called law, is a natural culmination of the incremental but no less systematic restrictions that have been imposed on the lives and rights of the people of Afghanistan since 2021. And at the same time, it's not an end point. It's not a magnum opus. Because since the law was announced, we've seen further discriminatory restrictions imposed. What's clear is that by regulating daily life through regulations, pervasive surveillance, and public punishments, the Taliban is instilling fear and forcing the people of the country into compliance under the guise of virtue enforcement. By weaponizing notions of virtue and vice, the Taliban enforces obedience, eliminates dissent, and maintains control over Afghan society. Their ideology turns morality into a tool of fear and domination, ensuring that individuals conform and they coerce, sometimes violently, towards compliance. Taliban have deprived women and girls of their most basic and fundamental rights, including the rights to freedom of movement, education, work, healthcare, expression, and access to justice. I've concluded in past reports before this year that this institutionalized system of gender-based oppression constitutes a widespread and systematic attack on the civilian population of Afghanistan and may constitute crimes against humanity, including gender persecution. My recent study on the Vice and Virtue Law further confirms that finding. I've been joined recently by the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, who in January requested that arrest warrants be issued for 2 top Taliban leaders for this very crime. The Taliban's gender oppression, reinforced by the Vice and Virtue Law, is deliberately and systematically designed, invoked, implemented, and led from the highest levels of the organization. The law codifies and consolidates existing restrictions, but also introduces new prohibitions, including for women to conceal their voices in public and prohibiting drivers from transporting women without a mahram. Moreover, it affects all Afghans, not just women and girls. Women and girls clearly bear the brunt, but men, boys, gender-diverse persons, ethnic and religious minorities, marginalized communities, and media workers are all impacted. No one is spared. I think I skipped that. Indeed, as I've mentioned, the Taliban is continuing to impose and enforce new restrictions. And in December, barred women from studying in medical institutes, including as trainee midwives and nurses. That decision will severely undermine access to healthcare, but with very severe consequences, particularly for women and girls. In my study, I also made a comparison about the restrictions in place now compared to the time of the Taliban rule in the 1990s. And some of you in the room will remember that period. I don't. The first time I went to Afghanistan was 2003, but some of you will remember. But what struck me is that they are mirror images. They're remarkably similar. And it's a step-by-step incremental process. It does demonstrate that ideologically, I think the Taliban hasn't changed. And the law is not only a reality on paper, its enforcement has been is being strongly felt by Afghans who've seen an increase of mutasibs, inspectors, inspecting people for compliance and carrying out warnings and punishments. It reinforces a pervasive climate of fear that I mentioned, in which many resort to self-regulation and self-censorship. Left unchecked, the Taliban is likely to intensify, expand, and further entrench its rights-violating measures on the people of Afghanistan, particular women and girls, and likely religious and ethnic minorities, subjecting them to ever-expanding cycles of discrimination, segregation, and oppression. A transgender woman told me after she fled the country and had been detained, beaten, and harassed, they do not see us as human. They targeted me and my family because of my gender identity. Now, Jonathan mentioned gender apartheid. So I'm just going to also briefly touch on this. The unparalleled situation in Afghanistan is consistently characterized by many Afghans as gender apartheid. For those who are not aware, while gender persecution, which I mentioned a moment ago, is a crime under the Rome Statute, crime against humanity, currently apartheid is a crime only in terms of race, not in terms of gender. But a campaign is underway to extend that to gender, possibly as part of a new human rights treaty on crimes against humanity that's being negotiated at the UN. This will take a number of years. And meanwhile, the term acts as a mobilizer, bringing people to public consciousness the stark reality of the Taliban's oppression of women and girls. I was pleased to hear at the current session of the Human Rights Council, Volker Turk, the High Commissioner of Human Rights, joining me in applying this term to the situation in Afghanistan. I mentioned earlier that there would be a human rights crisis in Afghanistan, even if we took out the factor of gender. And my other report recently touches on that. There are several elements that I focused on. First, I'll talk about is civic space, including the space for press freedom and NGOs and human rights defenders to operate freely. The space has been brought to its knees by the Taliban. Human rights defenders, including journalists and educators, remain at risk of detention, violence, threats, intimidation. This month, the Afghanistan Journalists Center announced that violations against the media and journalists increased by 24% last year. And journalists in Afghanistan have shared with me how they're closely scrutinized for compliance with meticulously enforced censorship rules. And anyone who works for or cooperates with what we now call the independent hybrid media, I can clarify that, they're Afghan media with their headquarters outside Afghanistan, broadcasting from outside, but with sources inside, they're at particular risk of retaliation by the Taliban. NGOs, especially those led by or centered on women, face tightening restrictions. And NGO leaders have told me how their licenses were not renewed and their activities stopped because they were promoting women's rights or were led by women. Protests, often led by women, have been driven underground. And a journalist said to me, the Taliban's restrictions on the press have made our work nearly impossible. We can no longer report freely, and fear of arrest or worse is constant. Our stories are silenced, and we're forced to navigate through a world where truth is a crime. In addition to the media and NGOs, artists, writers, poets, musicians, to name but a few, are not allowed to function openly. Academic freedom is restricted, and it will come as no surprise that booksellers are instructed to remove literature from their shelves, as in another country that comes to mind. It almost goes without saying that civic space continues to shrink due to fear, self-censorship, and harsh, intimidating enforcement. I also want to share some reflections related to religious, ethnic, and linguistic communities, particularly minority communities. In contrast with their gender-based violations, which they justify on Sharia grounds, the Taliban denies that minorities are treated unfairly. At the same time, when I speak with Hazara, Uzbek, Turkmen, and others, I hear about many unresolved grievances based on current and past violations of their rights. In this context, a point is often made that anyone who opposes the Taliban is persecuted no matter what their identity is, including Pashtun. Nevertheless, Afghanistan has a long history of serious violations against ethnic, religious, and other minority groups, almost always committed with impunity. And I'm very concerned by ongoing violent attacks against minorities. Last September, we witnessed a vicious targeted attack in Daikundi that killed 14 Hazara men. And 2 months later, an attack on a Sufi place of worship left 10 devotees dead in Baghlan province. Both attacks were claimed by Islamic State, Khorasan province, who specifically mentioned the religion of their targets. The Taliban has been so far unable or unwilling to prevent these attacks or to provide effective security to the communities concerned. It doesn't stop there. I also continue to receive reports of violence, threats, and intimidation against ethnic and minority communities in the context of land disputes without protection or effective redress. And Shia community members tell me they are frequently referred to in derogatory terms like kafir. I also note that some of the articles of the Vice and Virtue Law severely restrict the freedom of religion as well as cultural traditions, formalizing the prohibition of crosses and meticulously stipulating how to behave or how to appear. Beards are obligatory, as are religious practices, including praying 5 times a day in congregation. And despite calls from many governments, including the UK, the Taliban has failed to be more inclusive in its governance by continuing to exclude members of minority groups, or in fact, almost every group except their own, from public office, including as civil servants and university teachers. Research by the Middle East Institute, covering 1,166 persons in leadership positions in the de facto administration, indicates that approximately 90% are Pashtun and 5% are Tajik. In my recent report, I warn that these unaddressed grievances may be important early warning signs for future instability. In relation to children, I have a whole list of concerns. Explosive ordinances continue to harm children in great numbers, around 50 casualties a month, in total of which around 85% are kids. And of course, Afghanistan remains the only country where girls and women are barred from education beyond grade 6, as I've mentioned, depriving them from fulfilling their potential intellectually and professionally, depriving the society of women's productivity. And there's also a serious psychosocial impact with high levels of depression and suicidal ideation and suicide among girls and young women, as well as rising child and forced marriage and vulnerability to trafficking and abuse. There's too much child labor among boys as well as girls. And in other areas of life restricted by the Taliban, Afghans resist. I'm astonished by the determination of girls to continue to pursue education. And I also applaud the incredible efforts by providers of education to find opportunities for learning online, underground, and on radio and TV. Those providers are giving hope and filling an important gap, but they don't replace the responsibility of the state to provide a comprehensive education. In that regard, Afghans have shared with me their concern about the content of education for both boys and girls. Particularly not only education in madrasas, but education in regular schools. Given that the Taliban are trying to entrench themselves, win over future generations to their ideology and to reduce dissent, more attention needs to be given to children. I'm also mindful that, of course, Afghanistan's age profile is a very young country. It's around 50%, almost 50% are children. Yeah, and if you look at youth and define youth up to 30, it's well over 2/3. Yeah, I think the voice of youth needs to be heard more. I've met particularly with sort of 18, 19, 20-year-olds, and maybe a little bit older than that, looking around the room, who feel their voices are not being heard. And I think that's something that I would like to promote more. Coming towards the end, I think, but I just want to touch on a couple of other things. A very concerning aspect of Taliban rule is the use of corporal punishment. In 2024, my team documented 567 people who were flogged. That was 480 men and 87 women. 567. This year, up till the 14th of March, already 178 have been flogged. This is state-sanctioned whipping. There were 143 men and 35 women. The majority for crimes such as adultery and sodomy, but also for theft. Almost all of those beaten are also sentenced to terms of imprisonment. I noticed that the regular sentence is 39 lashes, and I've been asking Afghans, why 39? Is this religious? And no one has been able to give me the answer why judges are saying 39. If you know, please tell me. There's also been 6 public executions, as well as these public lashings. I mentioned right at the beginning the humanitarian crisis, which of course is intrinsically linked with human rights. This week, I also work at the Raoul Wallenberg Institute in Sweden, and we convened a round table in relation to the intersection between human rights and humanitarian work. I won't go into it now too much, but it was a very useful and rare exchange because we work in silos, and it was agreed we shouldn't. The humanitarians are in a terrible state because of the massive government slashing of their budgets. Human rights not much better off. Possibly it is an opportunity for a reset, for doing things in a different way. It's being forced, and maybe human rights needs to do the same. There's also a great concern about Afghan refugees. Some of you will be aware that on Monday, there's a deadline that Pakistan has given for Afghan refugees to move out of Rawalpindi and Islamabad, and some will be deported depending on their documents. All will be deported by the end of June. There's been approximately 2 million Afghans returned since September 23 that's just in 2 years, less than 2 years, from Iran and Pakistan. Others have been returned from Turkey. And even in Europe, some countries are considering or even have begun to return Afghans, despite a non-return advisory from UNHCR. We've got serious concerns about refoulement, as well as the increasing pressure on already scarce humanitarian resources. I'm approached regularly by many desperate Afghans in Afghanistan, terrified that they are going to be sent back to Afghanistan. Our advocacy so far has unfortunately fallen on deaf ears. But Pakistan has also, should be given some credit, as should Iran, for hosting millions of Afghans for decades. They deserve that credit. And I think that more wealthy countries need to start paying the bills, need to start shouldering some responsibility, as was expected under the Refugee Compact from 2015, I think, or 16. I know many of you are interested in the environment and climate change, and this is my last subject before I start looking ahead and at recommendations. Concerns about climate change and its impact in Afghanistan are slowly gaining more attention and traction, particularly because of devastating climate-induced disasters such as droughts and floods. I'm interested in a different element of environmental concern. That is the way that decades of armed conflict have affected the environment of Afghanistan, affected the war, the water, the soil, and the air. Think of all the bombs that have been dropped on Afghanistan, of all the IEDs, of all the explosives that have been left behind. And last month, together with a Special Rapporteur on Toxics and Human Rights, we held a webinar looking at the degradation of water, soil, and air. The extent of this problem, its causes and impacts, require further research and analysis, including to understand the responsibilities of all parties, as well as the gendered and intergenerational aspects. This can range from specific health effects of certain toxins on children to understanding the impact of environmental degradation on women-headed households. Now, looking ahead, I've repeatedly warned that the Taliban's extreme policies, especially its gender oppression and dehumanization of women and girls, are likely to fuel a dangerous ideology among generations of Afghans, particularly men and boys. And this could pose security risks in the region and beyond. I've had mothers saying to me, my son is surveilling me because of the message that he is getting about the role of women. We often are getting reports that boys' behavior is towards their mothers and their sisters is changing. And there's concern that these trends will only grow. In terms of the international community, it's clear that there's not only a moral or legal responsibility to take action, it's in their own interest to do so. Because left unchecked, the situation in Afghanistan will likely affect stability in the region and beyond. However, the international community has so far failed to turn the tide. And we, as I mentioned, we see glimpses of movement towards normalization, as well as severe cuts to international humanitarian support. Countering the Taliban's repression requires sustained and principled international pressure, strengthened support for Afghan civil society, particularly women, and an unwavering commitment to accountability. Central to this must be the establishment of clear human rights benchmarks for engagement with the Taliban and a united commitment to ensure that there will be no normalization of the de facto authorities unless and until there are demonstrable, measurable, and independently verified improvements in human rights. The lack of a strong, unified response from the international community has already emboldened the Taliban, We owe it to the people of Afghanistan not to embolden them still further through continued inaction. We must not allow history to repeat itself. Doing so would have devastating consequences in and beyond Afghanistan. On accountability, which I just mentioned, it's crucial to send a strong message, in my view, to the de facto authorities that there will be consequences for their actions. The ICC is gearing up, as we've seen. An accountability process has also started that might create a case in front of the International Court of Justice. In addition, I advocate for leveraging universal jurisdiction, as well as strengthening mechanisms to document human rights violations, both existing mechanisms, including my own. I'm getting less than 50% of the budget that was voted for by the UN in reality, and possibly through the establishment of a new independent investigation mechanism. For any change to happen, we need to use all tools available, perhaps create new ones. No single action will be effective on its own. So, as mentioned, I advocate for a coherent, principled approach from the international community towards Afghanistan, including that roadmap with human rights, in particular those of women and girls, at its core. And I think I'll end with that. We must have Afghans at the center. We in the international community must be supporting Afghans. Change will come through the efforts of Afghans, both those in exile and those who are still living inside Afghanistan. So with that, I'll conclude and thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Richard, for a forensic, sobering analysis and the call to arms in a sense at the end.